Welcome, thanks for attending. My name is Elise Spronk and I'm an occupational therapist in Pella, Iowa at Kinetic Edge Physical Therapy. I have been working with pediatric clients, children, families, teachers since, let's see, 2005, so quite a long time. Yeah, my passion is giving people tools and information that may help them in their journey with working with kids. And so I'm excited today to be offering something that's specifically for teachers, but also can be great for parents and yeah, obviously homeschool families, that type of thing. So anyway, we'll get started. I'm hoping to keep this to around 45 minutes or so. But yeah, we'll dive right in. So first of all, I wanted to share this picture with you. This comes from the How Does Your Engine Run curriculum. And it's, I feel like, just a really good representation of why we care about sensory processing when it comes to learning and behavior. And so if we were going to look at a child's function like a pyramid, the cognitive functioning and their intellect would be up at the top of the pyramid, as well as behavior and daily living activities. And so that's really where, a lot of us hope our children succeed and can do their best. And, really that it may becomes easy for them, that they don't have to struggle in those areas. And in order for those areas to be strong, there's all sorts of developmental tasks there in the middle, the perceptual motor development and the sensory motor development piece that really need to be fairly automatic for the child in order for them to be able to function their best up at the top. You can see then in this model that the sensory systems are the foundation of everything else. And so if this is like a Jenga game and we start to pull out bricks and things maybe start to be a little bit wobbly at the bottom, the child doesn't have that strong foundation at the bottom, it just makes all of those developmental skills that much more difficult and can make the academic learning, behavior, and daily living activity piece that much more difficult. Some models would put the reflex maturity, reflex integration at the foundation as well, and I would agree with that model too. So the sensory system and the reflex integration piece are really the foundation upon which all of the other skills develop. So now that kind of lays our foundation for the rest of our talk here today. So the sensory systems, I think that those first 5 sensory systems are ones that everybody is very familiar with: hearing, taste, smell, sight, touch. Those are probably the ones that you teach to your students when you're talking about the sensory system. But the bottom 3, the lesser known sensory systems, are extremely important in our development and in our functioning. So movement and vestibular sensory system, it provides information about where we are positioned in space and how we are moving. And so those receptors are in our inner ear, and they can detect various directions of movement as well as speed of movement. It gives us a physical reference also for our visual sense. And so we gain a lot of information about our peripheral vision related to our movement and our vestibular system. And so the vestibular system really helps build a foundation for handwriting, for bilateral coordination, and for a lot of our physical activities. In fact, there's even some research out there that shows that to a certain extent, we need to be moving in order to be able to listen better. So, the old adage, sit still and pay attention, sit still and listen, might not be a great phrase to be using. And so oftentimes, my perspective about movement has really changed a lot throughout the years. Whenever I used to see a child who was moving constantly, I felt like the only reason why they were moving constantly is because they had to move, and that was how their sensory system was developed. But I've become much more in tune to determining whether that's the case, or if it's a case where the child has the inability to be still and static. And so, sometimes we'll see that. And so that's a really key important factor when determining different seating positioning devices. We don't want to give a child a move and sit cushion if they don't have the core strength and the ability to be static. Then we're just going to be adding more to their difficulties. So the next one there, body position and proprioception. So proprioception receives input from our muscles, joints, and tendons, and it indicates to us how much force we need to use, where our body parts are in relationship to the rest of our body. We don't have to visually look at our hands when we're using our hands because of the proprioceptive system. The same is true for our feet. We don't have to watch our feet while we're walking to be able to step up onto a curb or to be able to do steps because of our proprioceptive sense. And so again, this one can be a huge factor with kids who maybe are clumsy, who are falling out of their chairs, who have difficulty with handwriting. So it's always good to check proprioceptive functioning. And then interoception is our body's ability to, or our brain's ability to detect how our body is feeling. And so this is our ability to know whether or not we need to use the restroom, whether or not we're hot or cold, if we're hungry or thirsty. And so it's that interoception sense that assists with that. So what is sensory processing? Well, sensory processing is the everyday neurological occurrence of taking information in from around our environment and from our bodies and using it in daily life. So it's something that occurs constantly throughout our day. And so it's just a natural neurological happening that hopefully is intact. And so when it's not intact, oftentimes we'll hear about sensory processing disorder. And there isn't actually a diagnosis code for sensory processing disorder, but we do know that there are dysfunctions that can happen in the sensory processing system. And usually those will occur in 3 different ways. Either the brain doesn't receive the right message, perhaps the brain isn't detecting it correctly. And the second way is that the brain is inefficient in taking the information that it's received and then integrating it into our activity and sending out the right messages. And so, if the brain doesn't send out accurate messages based on what it's received, then the child's actions or the adult's actions aren't going to be correct. And so again, this is where we start to see some, that clumsiness or, just the inappropriate responses to that sensory input. It's rather interesting. There's been some independent studies that have shown that sensory integrative dysfunction can be found in up to 70% of children who have been considered to have learning disabilities within our schools. And it doesn't confine itself into an age group or into a socioeconomic class or intellectual levels. And so it goes across the lifespan and across those socioeconomic borders. And so oftentimes, we'll talk about defensiveness, sensory defensiveness or hypersensitivity. And we're going to get into those different categories, but I did just want to kind of throw in here what you might see as far as behaviors related to these 3 different types of neurological dysfunction. You may see a child, these kids end up in that fight, flight, fright state of mind. And so the flight response are kids who, become the class clown in order to shift attention away from uncomfortable situations. And so, they're trying to take attention off of them. And so they become the class clown. The fright state would be those shy or reluctant kids, the ones who have a hard time communicating with you. And so they become focused on, being in that fright danger stage. And so their communication gets to be difficult. And then the fight kiddos are labeled usually as, those kids who have behavioral issues, because they often will use negative or resistive behaviors when they become, confronted about some of their difficulties. All right, so oftentimes we use the sensory profile by Winnie Dunn in our assessments of kiddos, and her assessment breaks down our sensory preferences into 4 distinct categories. And so we're just going to go through those. Again, when we look at creating a sensory friendly learning environment, we need to understand what type of sensory preferences those kids have. And so hopefully, even if they aren't necessarily being tested, you'll be able to kind of help, kind of determine based on the behaviors that you see, what category you think they might go into. Although there's a little, sometimes there's a little concern about doing that too. So if you have a real strong concern, it's best to recommend, like, hey, let's do a sensory profile and figure this out for sure. But so let's look at sensation avoiding. And so all of us, before we get started on this, all of us have are on a continuum of either needing a lot of sensory input in order for us to respond and notice, make a decision, or we're on the continuum of not needing as much sensory input in order to notice those differences, notice that sensory input. And so you can either have the high threshold, which are the people who need a lot of sensory input, or the low threshold, where you don't need much. The sensation avoiders have a low neurological threshold, meaning it does not take much sensory input for those avoiders to notice. And when that sensory threshold becomes to the point where it's being met too often, that can become uncomfortable or frightening for the child. And so again, these are those kids who have a withdraw behavior or an emotional outburst to get out of situations because that sensory threshold has been met too much. They are resistant to change. They like to know what's going to happen. They're the kiddos who, one little change like testing the fire alarms may, cause a disruption to their day. And so they, what we want to try and do for these kids is, give them a prep time, help them know, when that schedule might change or when things might be different. And obviously that's not always possible. But we want to help, kind of expand that bubble of what's acceptable. And so that they can start to begin to tolerate things better. But just, understanding that the why behind the what, right? The why behind the behavior that you're seeing. And if it's, a child who's having some difficulties with their sensory processing and they're an avoider, that can be a explanation for some of the behavior you might be seeing. Poor registration. These kids have a high threshold, so they need a lot of sensory input. And the thing about the poor registration kids is that they're going to be passive in achieving that high need for sensory input. So oftentimes they will appear tired, they'll maybe appear apathetic, because if something isn't sensory enough, they aren't going to attend to it. So oftentimes I feel like these kids don't necessarily get detected because they aren't having a behavioral issue. But I think as they go through their grade school years, when they get into maybe those middle elementary years, is when we start to detect the poor registration. You know, for example, you know, these kids, you may struggle with a cue like get your math book out and turn to page 34 and start on problem 5. You know, that was just an auditory cue. They need probably a visual cue to go with that auditory cue. They may need you to, you know, a tactile cue, like you're putting your hand on their shoulder, in order for that to be a higher sensory experience for them. And so, you know, the reason why I say probably those middle elementary years is when we start to notice these kids, is because up until that point, you know, you as an educator have probably just gone over to their desk and found the book and opened it up for them because you notice like, oh, they still don't have their book out. And so, you know, but then when you start to expect a little bit more responsibility and a little bit more ability to, you know, follow those cues, then that's when these kids start to appear. So the sensation seekers also have a high neurological threshold, but they are going to be active to achieve that. So these are often those kids who are continuously engaging, they're active, they're fidgety, they're kind of all over the place. You know, these are the kids you do a shaving cream activity and they are in it and probably have shaving cream up to their shoulders. And, you know, it's only 2 minutes into the activity and they're already done. You know, so yeah, they probably are a little bit more on your radar because they're just more, yeah, they're touching everything. They're the kids who maybe struggle with standing in line because they need a little bit more sensory input than just simply standing there. All right, we got a question here. I've never had somebody raise a hand. Oh, here we go. Okay, Shauna, yeah, do you have a question? Oh, you're muted. Did you want to ask a question?
Sorry, I think I bumped it.
Okay, no problem, no problem. All right. Okay. So the next one here, let me see if I can get this off here. Okay, so now we move on to the sensitivity to stimuli kids, or the sensors. So they have a low neurological threshold. Again, they're going to be passive in this process. So, you know, the avoiders also have that low neurological threshold, but they are active, whereas the sensitivity to stimuli kids, they just, you know, aren't going to have an outburst or a meltdown, but they're going to be very distractible and very hyperactive. So these are the kids who, you know, respond to the newest thing possible. And, you know, oftentimes their attention will be, you know, taken away from what they're doing. If a classmate gets up to go talk to the teacher or somebody drops a pencil on the floor, you know, that'll pull them away from what they're doing. And they may have a hard time coming back to that task. And so again, you know, with these kids, they don't need more sensory input necessarily. They need the right type of sensory input. So we're going to be getting to that. One of the issues that may occur is modulation difficulties. So modulation is basically our brain's ability to either ramp something up for us or dampen it. So, you know, it's kind of that filtering process. And so some kids may just need more time to get used to something. You know, I really think about this one a lot of times with like the tactile activities, where, you know, the child may need time to, you know, get into the shaving cream, get into what they're, you know, playing with. And oftentimes you're finished with that activity because, again, the seeker is already done. And so, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that the child is never going to participate in that. It just means that they may need again, you know, a little more time. So. All right. So really, you know, self-regulation is our ability to, you know, first of all, detect how we're feeling and then change that arousal level based on our sensory systems. And so this is just a natural thing that usually occurs for most people. You know, like I've got my water bottle here. It's all, you know, my mouth is dry, but oftentimes, you know, water bottles and sucking on something can keep us alert and focused. And so, you know, it's our brain's ability to use those sensory systems to improve our arousal level. So, you know, one of the examples I often will give is, let's say you're driving home late at night and you need to stay awake. You are probably not going to talk yourself into staying awake, correct? You're not going to be telling yourself over and over, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, pay attention, stay awake. But rather, you're going to maybe listen to a certain type of music. You're going to have certain type of snacks or drinks with you in the car. You may need to stop the car and walk around a little bit. So those are all sensory things that you're doing in order to keep yourself awake and alert. Well, the same is true for a child in a classroom. You know, telling them to pay attention is probably not going to get as good of results as using some of the sensory systems to help achieve that level of alertness. And the same can be true for being calm. You know, when we're upset or frustrated, you know, it's pretty hard to talk a child out of a meltdown, right? Talking it through. But if you can use a sensory system, that oftentimes will be more effective. All right, so this is one of my favorite handouts, and this is called the Sensory Motor Planning Worksheet, and it was developed by an occupational therapist named Patricia Otter, and again, it's in that How Does Your Engine Run curriculum, but it is based off of studying the brain and helps determine whether a sensory experience is calming for us or whether it's alerting. And so if you're looking at your screen, on the left side of your screen, you're going to see taste and smell and oral texture. And so those two sensory experiences are the easiest for our brains to process. Therefore, they would be considered calming. And so if you think about our sensory experiences, even with our infants, the first way that an infant learns how to calm themselves is through sucking. And it oftentimes will continue throughout our lifespan that our mouth can be a very regulating experience for us. And so as we move down from the left side to the right side, you're going to see that those sensory experiences become more difficult for our brains to process, therefore alerting. So visual auditory are the two most alerting sensory experiences for our brains. And, you know, where do our kids spend much of their school day? In the visual auditory sensory experiences. As you move down these columns, our sensory processing also goes from calming to alerting. So if we're going to look at taste and smell, the sweet vanilla taste is going to be much easier for our brains to process, more calming for our brains than bitter or smoke. So it's probably why, you know, coffee is a popular morning drink in order to get us alert and awake, in addition to the caffeine. And so again, go over to the auditory category, you know, vibration sound or rhythm, you know, rhyming, rhythmical, singing a song. You know, I always applaud the, you know, preschool and kindergarten teachers who are, you know, using a lot of songs and their children are just, you know, following everything. You know, those types of auditory experiences are going to be much easier for our brain to process than just verbal language. In fact, you know, language is down there on the bottom right side of the page and is the most difficult sensory input for our brain to process. And so there again, evidence why we can't talk kids out of a meltdown. So if we were going to look at, sometimes we can think about sensory experiences as being organizing for our brain. So those middle 3 columns, tactile, vestibular movement, and vestibular gravity, are organizing for our brains. And so what do we mean by organizing? I always say these are your go-tos. If you're not sure what to do, go to the organizing categories, go to joint and muscle activity. Oftentimes we call it heavy work. Have those kiddos do some things that engage that joint and muscle activity. Bouncing, jumping can be extremely organizing for the brain. Swinging, so those kiddos who need some sensory input, try and encourage swinging during recess. It's a great vestibular movement activity to help regulate. The same then could be true of the middle 2 rows. Those 2 rows are also considered organizing. So when we're looking at kids who are like the avoiders or the sensitivity sensors, the ones who are just more distractible, that have that low sensory input or low sensory threshold. And I said, these kids don't need more sensory input, they need the right kind of sensory input. Those are kids who need to do things from those middle 2 columns. So, encouraging parents to send a crunchy snack. If you're a school that has kids bring, mid-morning snacks. If you're a classroom that allows gum, that can be a really organizing sensory tool. And so, again, that we're going to go through more specific activities next here, but I wanted to give you kind of the framework of why we choose certain activities as part of, a child's, sometimes it's referred to as a sensory diet. Diet to me implies it's something you do for a short period of time, at least in my world. So, but it's kind of that prescription of what, is going to be helpful for the child. And it's based off of, studying the brain and what we know to be true. So, all right, so let's talk about just some general organizing sensory activities. So again, it's difficult, right? You've got a classroom full of kids and you've got a lot of different sensory preferences going on. And so, how do you create that sensory friendly environment that's going to be good for most children, right? There's always going to be a couple that need, some extra help. And so, I'm choosing here from the organizing columns and rows. So limiting, outside auditory input. So, as much as you can, trying not to have too much extra auditory input. Again, they're getting a lot of auditory input naturally through language and that, verbal instruction. So limiting some of the other that might be distracting can be helpful. Reducing, loud and surprise factors. So, sometimes with, different alarms or bells or, that type of thing can be very disruptive to certain children. And if you've observed that and know that, helping them know that that's coming up, so maybe they can, cover their ears or not experience that surprise as intensely. Again, linear and oscillating movement. So anytime, you can encourage kids to be on the swings or, doing some jumping activities is going to be a good movement activity. Salty, crunchy, spicy, sour, chewy. Those are going to be oral inputs that'll be more organizing. And then deep, firm pressure touch. Putting a hand on a shoulder, never using, light tickly touch, but always using firm, deep pressure touch. we talked about how some of the kiddos, the avoiders, like routine and like things to be the same. So, you know, if you're using a daily schedule, that's awesome. That can just help kids understand what's coming up for the day, discussing unexpected events before they happen. Obviously, that can't always happen because sometimes things are really, really unexpected. But understanding then if that's the case, that you may see some different behaviors. And again, just understanding the why behind the what. Using songs in your classroom. So, you know, the cleanup song or the new game song, or, you know, creating some of your own for some of those transitions, because sometimes kids struggle with the transition from, you know, maybe your room to a special or that type of thing. And so using a song can be helpful. Limiting extraneous visual material. I heard a speaker years ago, a teacher, talk about, you know, what the classroom should look like. And her big thing was, you know, only including visual material that was necessary for instruction. You know, maybe this takes some pressure off of you for all of the extra bulletin board stuff and, you know, that type of thing. But really, you know, keeping things as, you know, simple as possible can be helpful just for those kids who are distracted by visual information. Therefore, like also using cubbies or labeled places for different things, totes, that type of thing. And then, you know, sometimes helping kids with desk organization, just because it can get, you know, pretty messy and chaotic, can really help with helping their visual sensory input. And then, yeah, using tape numbers or letter lines on a desk so that they aren't, you know, rather than just like up on a board or something like that. So it's nearby and they aren't getting distracted visually as their eyes move from the desk to wherever it is across the room. Perhaps having a quiet corner or a hideout area in your room if you have extra space, where, you know, if a child needs to just have a little chill out time, they can get to that corner. Or maybe you as a teacher can use that corner. You know, encouraging breathing before transitions. There's so much awesome regulation that can happen through deep breathing. And so, you know, in through the nose, out through the mouth, incorporating that into different activities throughout your day. Marching from one activity to the next. Great for your kids, maybe not great for the kids who are, you know, whose rooms you're passing in the hallway. But again, you're getting joint and muscle activity. So, you know, marching, animal walks, that type of thing can be great for that joint and muscle activity. Wall push-ups, chair push-ups, again, a great way to get joint and muscle activity. And those can be pretty quiet, you know, and can be done pretty easily. The use of hand fidgets can be helpful. You know, I think hand fidgets probably sometimes get a bad rap because they can become a toy. So, you know, you really want to select hand fidgets that are quiet, that aren't toys, and maybe don't need to be used all of the time, but can be used some of the time. In addition to the tactile processing piece that hand fidgets provide, they also, you know, in the center of our hand, it's our Babkin spot, and it can be very helpful for releasing endorphins and helping calm us. So sometimes you'll see people who are nervous be fidgety and kind of be, you know, writhing their hands. And so I think, you know, there can be some benefit to having input to that hand. So maybe you don't even use hand fidgets, but you could also, you know, just kind of do some little hand massage. We often will do like finger munchies. So they're just pushing with their other hand. Sorry, I'm hoping you can see me. I lost my picture of myself when I switched over there. So, but yeah, you're just doing these little finger munchies down the thumbs. And then movement breaks. Movement breaks are awesome. Recess is awesome. You know, kids need to move. And so incorporating that even into, your classroom activities is fantastic. All right, so we're going to get into now each specific sensory experience. Some of these will be redundant because we kind of included them in the organizing activities, but I wanted to point out that, I feel like I get a lot of referrals for kids who have a lot of the extra oral activity going on. They might be licking their lips a lot, chewing their shirts to pieces, perhaps eating writing utensils. And so really it's a communication to us. A lot of times, if something is challenging to us, our central nervous system will pull our mouth in order to help. Again, it's a, a communication to us that, hey, this kiddo might be doing something that's either A, stressful, or B, challenging. And so respecting that communication that we're seeing, that nonverbal natural, automatic communication, and, either talking to the parents about it, helping them figure out, something else more appropriate to chew on, can be necessary. And again, there are also some reflexes that could be present that might be causing that oral input. So if it's a, something that you feel is kind of beyond your knowledge base, then, recommending occupational therapy can be helpful. So oral activities to use in the classroom. Again, remember, our oral sensory system is the most calming sensory system we have. It's the first way we learn how to calm as babies and can continue to be our friend throughout our lifetime. So finding ways to use the mouth in instruction can be helpful. So, cotton ball math or alphabet games where, the child has a straw and they're, blowing a cotton ball to different numbers or different letters, that type of thing can be a fun activity. Obviously, there's concerns about germs, so you need to be smart about that. But it can be a great tool. Providing, the kiddos something to drink or chew on. Using straws is, because when we suck through a straw versus just drinking, we engage our oral muscles. And again, could be considered heavy work. And so you're kind of getting two different calming strategies with one activity, right? Using gum, if that's allowed, water bottles, chewy necklaces. I love Camelback water bottles because they have a bigger mouthpiece that you can bite and suck on at the same time. And, now there's a lot of other types of water bottles too, but those can be really helpful for kids who need a little extra help with their regulation. So tactile activities, thinking about clothing for kids. So if you're seeing a child who seems really uncomfortable and are, kind of moving around a lot, fidgeting, not wanting to sit with their back up against the chair, sometimes it can be an uncomfortable clothing situation. So maybe mentioning that to a parent. Fortunately, I feel like our clothing expectations have changed throughout the years, and kids are wearing more comfortable clothing versus more of like the button downs and jeans. So I think that's really helped. But realizing that I've had it before where if my clothes are not feeling comfortable, it can be very distracting, and all I'm thinking about is how uncomfortable I am. And so understanding that could be a factor in what you're seeing. We talked about hand fidgets already, deep pressure hand hugs. So that's just like, providing some deep pressure down the arms, or, teaching kids to do their little finger munches. And so, yeah, pencil grips, sometimes how a pencil without a pencil grip can feel uncomfortable in a child, and they get little calluses on there. So, you know, I'm not necessarily referring to specialized pencil grips to improve their grasp pattern, but even just like the foam pencil grips to put on there just to make the pencil more comfortable. Proprioceptive activities. So again, we're using joints and receptors in our joints and muscles to send endorphins to our brain to help with regulation. And so heavy work can be a great tool. So, you know, if you've got a child who you think, boy, this kiddo needs some heavy work, send them, you know, get a crate, fill it up with books and tell them to bring it to the office. And maybe you and the, you know, office assistant have a little working relationship where she understands, okay, he just needed to get out and do a little heavy work. Stretchy bands on the bottoms of chairs can be helpful for kids. You know, they can push against those and get some of that joint and muscle activity. Also gives them a purposeful way to move if you're seeing kids who are moving a lot in their chairs. Fabric tube, so that's really more like a tunnel type, big long tunnel. And, you know, depending on how big your classroom is, that can be a fun transition way. And then if you can incorporate, you know, obstacle courses and movement into different aspects of your room and your instruction, that can also be a great way to incorporate those proprioceptive activities. So balance and movement, again, you know, some kids need to spin and some kids need not to spin. So if you can look at like jumping and swinging, those are going to be your go-tos. Sometimes, you know, a child can benefit from a move and sit cushion. If you don't have access to those, and those can be pretty expensive, using a beach ball with just a little bit of air in it can give the same type of sensory input. And it's a great way to test it out. So you know whether or not the move and sit cushion is going to be helpful. And, you know, oftentimes I love it if there can be more than one type of different, you know, sensory tool, so that a child isn't singled out and maybe there's a few kids who are trying something at the same time. And so, you know, offering that to different kids at different times. You know, sitting on a ball can be great if they, you know, if they have the core strength and the stability to handle that. Again, you're going to get that oscillating up and down movement, you know, from being on a ball. So vision and sight activities, again, you know, a lot of this is probably more in the removal of a lot of extra visual information. You know, so sometimes even like a child, I just talked to a child I was working with about, you know, math is a really stressful thing for her. And so we talked about, you know, is it because on a math worksheet there's all these different problems and you just don't even hardly know where to start? So, you know, using another piece of paper to cover up part of that and kind of working your way down. Same thing with reading, you know, using a bookmark so you aren't necessarily looking at the whole entire page all at once, can be helpful. Thinking about the lighting in your classroom, you know, the fluorescent lighting is great for lighting up the space, but sometimes can get a little overstimulating, especially maybe in the afternoon. So maybe you have times where you turn the lights off and you just use your natural window light. And then, yeah, we talked about having a calming space in the room. And, you know, again, probably more of this has to do with reducing visual input to really kind of help with the regulation. And then auditory activities. So music can be very helpful at times, remembering that if you want it to be calming for the kids, it should be at 50 to 70 beats per minute, which will mimic their heart rate. And you know, some kids will love to have the music and some kids might not. So maybe you have noise canceling headphones, you know, especially if you're using music just like during their independent work time, realizing that that will work for a lot of kids, but might not work for everyone. You know, thinking about it, the environmental sounds. So sometimes it's nice to, you know, have windows open or doors open, but just realizing that, okay, there's a lot of extra noise coming in the classroom that way. Or even, you know, those kids who have a really low threshold for sensory input are going to notice if there is a light that's buzzing, or, you know, something that's ticking, or, you know, that type of thing. And so just being aware of that, and taking that into you know, account if you're wondering why there's maybe some different behaviors happening. You know, varying your instruction, even like your voice projection, that type of thing can be helpful. Using rhyming, rhythmical voice patterns can be very helpful. All right, this is a QR code that you can take a picture of, scan it. We do free screens in our locations where we see kiddos. So that's Pella, Oskaloosa, Newton, Des Moines, and Ames. And so if you're, you know, working with a child and you feel like, okay, I've tried a lot of this stuff, but it's not, I think we need a little more. We need a little more direction. You know, and again, remembering that, okay, the sensory processing is one part of that foundational piece, but the reflex integration is another. You know, having the parents contact us for a free screen can be a great way to determine whether or not we need, you know, there could be more things that could be helpful for that child. And then this is my email address, elises@kineticedgept.com. I love connection with teachers and parents. And so please don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions. I've found that, you know, it's just can be really helpful when you have somebody who's willing to collaborate, you know, and what you're doing is a tough job. You know, you've got a whole room full of kids, and so you want to, you know, make sure that you're able to address those needs, and it can be a challenging thing. So I'm happy to always answer questions and help. So, all right, let's take this time to, if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat or in that QA up on the top, and we can do some question and answer time. Anyone? Oh, I finally figured out how to bring my video back up. All right, I will stay here just for a few more minutes. If you do have any questions or comments, again, I'm more than happy to answer those. So. Oh, we got one here. Oh, you're welcome, Tegan. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. Okay, a question. As far as bulletin boards, what would you consider distracting? I'm teaching kindergarten. And so, you know, I guess that's a great question. And I think, you know, as long as you're keeping your bulletin boards to things that they really need to understand and need to know. So like a calendar bulletin board is great, or different bulletin boards that might share, you know, different information and that type of thing. I think those are awesome. And so thinking about the purpose behind the bulletin board, and then, thinking about what other types of bulletin boards do I have that maybe I don't need to have, or I think, I'm thinking even more about, and maybe you can't even do that anymore, like hanging things from the ceiling or, displaying kids' artwork. They love that, but maybe you can do that in the hallway instead of in the room. And so I think, just really thinking about that, thinking about maybe what colors you're using. And so there can be more, obviously we want, bright and colorful, that's great, but maybe using kind of the same color families, that type of thing. But again, I'm not saying no bulletin boards, although if you want me to say that, that's fine. But thinking more like what's on the bulletin board, and is it going to be something that's helpful for the child, or is this just, an extra? And I think then you don't necessarily need all of the extras. So yes, you will get, as a participant, you'll get an email with a link to the presentation, so you'll be able to rewatch it. So, Megan comments, my son is going to be much bigger going to a much bigger school this year and won't know anyone. Yeah, that can be, a bit of a challenge. You said he graduated OT. Sometimes, those are situations where doing a little refresher back at OT can be helpful to help with that transition. So if you're starting to notice that the beginning of the school year isn't working out great and you feel like, okay, maybe we need to go back to OT, then I would certainly recommend that, and just do, get a little refresher with that. Let me scroll down here. Oh yeah, okay, sorry, Megan, I hadn't scrolled down. When he showed signs of anxiety, so how can you help him? I would definitely focus on heavy work and some of those organizing sensory activities even before school. So I'm not quite sure where you went to OT, but hopefully, maybe there were some different techniques that they showed you. There's a lot of different manual techniques, hands-on techniques that you could do that release endorphins to the brain. Embracing squeeze, figure eights, different things like that. If you have additional specific questions, I love for you to reach out or email. I'm gonna type my email address in here again, because I think there could be some great things that would be helpful for him to do before school. So, but yeah, and even thinking about what kind of breakfast is he having, and helping him, have him be an active participant in determining, hey, these are things that, we refer to it as make my engine just right. These are some things I could try before, but yeah, in those new different situations, I think, again, remembering that there are people to help him, and, talking with school counselors is a great idea. Using those resources can be very helpful as well. So, all right. I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anyone else have anything else? All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for participating. And hold on, I got a couple more. All right, great. Thanks, ladies. All right, and again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions that you'd like to talk about afterwards, okay? Thanks so much, everyone.